Good afternoon from Singapore, and for those around the region, good morning and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that you're all keeping well. I'm Michael Chapnick, Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the Apec Secretariat, and I'll be moderating this virtual briefing today. With that, let's get started. First, we'll hear from Dr. Rebecca Santamaria.
Hold on a second. Yes. Good day, everybody. And greetings from the Secretariat. I'm pleased that you have made the time to be with us. As Michael has indicated, the APEC Economic Leaders Week for 2021 began last Friday with the concluding meeting of the APEC senior officials. Later today, the APEC ministers meet under the theme Joint Work, Grow Together, and the week will culminate with the APEC Economic Leaders meeting on the 12th of November. And as you know, this will be chaired by Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern and will provide strategic vision and policy directives for the APEC economies going forward. A vital element of the APEC process, the Policy Support Unit's reports are specific to the situation and needs of the region. They ensure that policy decisions are made by the forum and that these policy decisions are informed by tailor-made analysis and recommendations. Today's launch of the APEC Regional Trends Analysis comes in two parts. The first chapter is the iteration of the Regional Trends Analysis and updates us on economic trends. And the second is the thematic chapter, which zeroes in on a topic that PSU's analysts think that APEC should look more closely at. The economic trends chapter, and you will hear more of this from both Dr. Dennis Hu and Emmanuel, is of course dominated by the pandemic, its effects on the region's economy, projections, as well as recommendations for economic recovery. The thematic chapter explores climate change, a topic that has also dominated the headlines in the past week. It explores how APEC economies affect climate change and how we are affected by it. APEC's economies can make major contributions by accelerating actions towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework for Convention on Climate Change. So the APEC Economic Leaders Week could not be timelier. These two topics mirror the preoccupations of APEC officials over the last 2 years, namely the response to COVID-19, and the second, the new APEC vision for the next 20 years, which projects, among other things, a sustainable regional economy. So both topics are, to a large extent, existential. COVID-19 is damaging millions of lives and livelihoods, while climate change, with all the contemporary havoc that it's already wreaking, will be even more catastrophic in the future if we do not act now. And like COVID, climate change is an issue where the scientific community can only do so much before policymakers will need to step in to enact real change. So this report will provide the necessary input into the discussions this week on efforts to strengthen recovery, increase inclusion and sustainability, and pursue innovation in a digitally enabled recovery. So I thank Dr. Hu and his team, and I look forward to the presentations and also to the interactions with the members of the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Santamaria. Next, we have Dr. Dennis Hu, Director of the APEC Policy Support Unit, to brief us on the latest regional trends. Dennis?
Thank you, Michael. Let me try to just put up my PowerPoint presentation. Right. So thanks very much. And what I'd like to do for the next 10-15 minutes is to share with you our latest APEC Regional Trends Analysis report. And as Rebecca mentioned, there's actually two parts to that report. The first part is what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about the economic outlook for the region, some of the challenges that they face, particularly addressing the pandemic. And we have a special theme chapter for this issue as well, looking at some of the challenges that APEC is facing with climate change. So let me just start. So we can see from these numbers, the quarterly numbers, that we're beginning to see an economic turnaround from the fourth quarter of 2020. And then we can see here the reported numbers starting from the first and second quarters of this year, quite a strong economic recovery. For the first quarter of this year, we're looking at 6.2%, and the second quarter at 10.1%. And what's been driving that recovery has been both consumption as well as investments. We're looking at private consumption growing for the first half of 2021 at about 6.5%, and investments at about 13%. We also had some support as well from government spending, which provided that much needed stable support for businesses as well as for households in many APEC economies. And that grew from the first half of 2021 at 5.5%. At the same time, that recovery, if you look at this chart here, is beginning to look a little bit like a two-track recovery. There is divergence in different APEC economies and how they are recovering. And we find that those who have rolled out their vaccines quicker have been able to recover in a much faster pace than economies that have a much more lower rollout, or have, as well as they have limited financial resources as well to support households. So we are unfortunately seeing that kind of two-track recovering happening, and which I think needs to be addressed. And I'll talk a little bit about that in some of my other slides. So we're seeing that essentially what we're calling it a vaccine divide that's happening in the region. Now, if we look at it globally, we also see that vaccine disparity also happening globally as well. As at October 2021, almost 7 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered globally, but only about 3.1% of people in low-income economies have received at least one dose. And that's, that kind of translates to about 49% of the global population having been inoculated with at least one dose. And unfortunately, that's alarmingly below the target that's been set by the Task Force on COVID-19 Vaccines, Therapeutics, and Diagnostics for developing economies, which was aiming for about 40% vaccination rate in every economy across the world by the end of 2021, and 60% by the first half of 2022. Within APEC itself, based on the October numbers, we see that there's quite a large variation, ranging from 190 doses per 100 persons to as low as about 3.2 doses per 100 persons. Overall, about 15 out of 21 APEC economies have vaccinated at least 40% of their population. Now let's look at about trade. We also see that trade has also outperformed this year, and that's given a much needed boost to the economic and in both consumption and trade activities that we're seeing in the region. And that increase in trade is broad-based, covering manufactured goods, chemicals, machineries, clothing, footwear, sportswear. We see an expansion in many of these different goods and products, as well as trade in COVID-19 associated goods, such as pharmaceuticals, telecommunication equipment, and computers have remained pretty buoyant. So both merchandise exports and imports here, both either in volume terms or in value terms, have both reported double-digit growth rates. So as we look at it in terms of the full year, we're looking at the APEC region expecting to grow by about 6% in 2021, and that would moderate to about 4.9% in 2022. As I mentioned, there's been also a significant increase in trade in the region, but also globally. WTO itself upgraded its short-term forecast for the volume of world merchandise trade to about 10.8% expansion in 2021 compared to a 5.3% contraction in 2020. And I think, again, as I mentioned as well, that these strong growth rates do mask quite considerable divergence in economic growth rates once we look at it in terms of individual economies. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, particularly in ensuring that all APEC economies have access to vaccines. As more and more people have access to these vaccines, and it becomes easier for the economies, businesses to open up, and we see a much more stronger recovery in all APEC economies. I think as we look ahead in 2022, we continue to be a bit cautious and on guard. There are a number of downside risks that does dominate the economic outlook and growth prospects that we look at for this year, but particularly also in 2022. There's concerns, of course, of resurgence of the Delta variant infections. In fact, if you read the recent news, that's already started, particularly in Eastern Europe. And the possible mutations that comes out of it that may, hopefully not, but could lead to a reimposition of movement restrictions. So this stop-start type of opening of economies would have an impact on the growth numbers that we see. And we see that resurgence of the Delta variant has led to many international organizations to also trim down their forecast for this year, including us. I mean, if you look at the August update for ATA, we forecast this year at about 6.4%, and that's been trimmed down to about 6%. Some other concerns in terms of downside risk also is related to inflation. And there's a special box section in the report that talks about some of the causes of those inflation. There's both in terms of supply and demand. On the demand side, we see that increase in consumer demand for different types of goods, and in a way outstripping supply, and that has led to an increase in prices. But we're also concerned on the supply side. We've seen supply chain and logistics disruptions that makes it difficult for many goods to be delivered, and that has also led to concerns about rising prices. So the other concern, of course, is also rising public debt. Right now in APEC, based on the 2020 numbers, we're looking at about almost 65% of public government debt as a percentage of GDP, and that may increase to about, we're looking at about 66.5% in the medium term. Again, that is something that we also need to monitor as we move forward. So with some of these downside risks, of course, it translates to concerns of a much more tightening of fiscal as well as monetary policies. And that could, of course, lead to a dampening of economic activities in the region and having an impact on the economic growth prospects for next year. Right. As we move forward, I think we've had the pandemic has been with us for more than a year and a half now, and I think there's quite a lot of hard lessons that we have learned over that time in many APEC economies. And certainly one of the hard lessons that we've learned is that, or at least what lies at the core of these lessons is that economic, trade, as well as health policies are all intertwined. And in particular, what's crucial here is that good policies do matter. And these policies are particularly crucial in delivering three key priorities. One is to vaccinate as many people as possible to narrow that vaccine divide that I talked about. Second is to eliminate or reduce the different types of export restrictions to facilitate the free flow of vaccines and medical goods, as well as food, essential food products. And thirdly is to mitigate the economic, social, as well as vaccine divide that we see that's happening in the region as well as globally. As we talked about in some of our other reports, the pandemic in many ways has exacerbated some of the existing differences and inequalities that exist in And I think that's one of the things that we need to address, particularly in implementing much more inclusive policies. Again, as we move towards moving forward in a post-pandemic environment, I think all APEC economies need to come together to commit to key effective good policies to, as I mentioned, to facilitate the freer flow of essential goods and services, but also to share knowledge and expertise of measures in tackling COVID-19. We've got a year and a half of experience now. In APEC itself, in the APEC website, you could take a look at our new website. We have the APEC COVID-19 latest and immediate virtual exchange, or live for short, and that digital platform provides a lot of different types of information and policies that have been implemented, and essentially sharing of best practices, what APEC has been very good at for many, many years. Again, here, I think as we try to build a much more resilient economic recovery, I think what's important here as well is to look at, as I mentioned, looking at much more inclusive policies to narrow that economic and social divide, but also to utilize the different types of digital technologies to support healthcare systems as well as education and other types of recovery effects. I've mentioned before in some of the previous presentations that in many ways the pandemic has led to an acceleration in the applications of different types of technologies. And that's been a lifeline for many small, medium enterprises, being able to use these various digital platforms to be able to continue to do business and survive. And that's really it for me. And I'll pass it on to my colleague, Emmanuel, who will talk about our theme chapter on climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Dennis. There's certainly a lot to chew on, and members will be meeting this week to share those experiences, both in the APEC ministerial meeting this evening, at the APEC CEO Summit later this week, and finally at the leaders meeting. Now we'll hear from Emmanuel San Andreas, who's an analyst with the APEC Policy Support Unit. He will brief us on APEC's climate change challenge and how APEC members could respond for a resilient recovery. Emmanuel?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dennis. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for joining us for the briefing on the November 2021 issue of the APEC Regional Trends Analysis. While I'm waiting for, there we go. Yes, thank you very much. I'll just have a few slides, but I'll try to go through them quickly. Next slide, please. The APEC region is severely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. 70% of natural disasters occur here. Just this year, we've had record-setting wildfires, floodings, droughts, and extreme temperature. Estimates show that the climate change is costing APEC economies $100 billion annually, and that is not yet counting the human and social costs. Climate change also disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations, including the poor, migrants, indigenous peoples, and people in rural and remote areas. Compared to men, women are 14 times more likely to die during disasters, and the impacts are even more pronounced for poor women who are more vulnerable to climate-sensitive health risks. But while the poor are disproportionately affected by climate change, it is the rich who disproportionately contribute to it through overconsumption. The richest 10% of the global population are responsible for half of carbon emissions, while the poorest half contribute just 7% of emissions. Next slide, please. But even as the APEC region suffers disproportionately from climate change, it disproportionately contributes to climate change too. In the last 30 years, annual greenhouse gas emissions from APEC economies increased from 16 billion tons to 28 billion tons, growing at an average rate of almost 2% per year. In 2018, APEC made up 38% of the world's population and 55% of GDP, but it contributed 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 65% of carbon emissions. 7 of the world's 10 largest carbon dioxide emitters are in APEC. Next slide, please. However, this is not to say that APEC has not discussed or prioritized climate change before. APEC leaders have stressed the importance of protecting the environment since their first meeting in 1993. In fact, climate change first appeared in an Apec leader statement in 1997, when they reiterated the importance of accelerating action to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. Some achievements have been racked up by Apec since then. The region's forest cover increased by 22.7 million. Previous slide, please. Can we go back 2 slides? There we go. The region's forest cover increased by 22.7 million hectares between 2008 and 2020. Environmental goods made up 5.2% of Apec's total merchandise trade in 2019. Around $92.3 billion were invested in green and pro-environment projects in Apec in 2020. And Apec economies are on track to doubling their share of renewables in the energy mix by 2030. Moreover, 19 of Apec's 21 member economies are at least seriously considering net zero targets by 2060 or earlier. In fact, 4 Apec economies, that is Canada, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, have enacted net zero commitments into their domestic laws. Next slide, please. But even as we recognize achievements, we also recognize that these are not nearly enough to address climate change. You may have seen versions of this chart over the past weeks. This chart is based on the IPCC's recommendations on how fast and by how much greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions need to come down to have a good chance at keeping global temperatures between either 1.5 or 2.0 degrees Celsius. The chart is based on rough estimates of what the Apec region needs to do to achieve these targets. I call this the mountain chart because it looks like a nice mountain slope, but it also because it represents the mountain of effort needed to give our region the best chance of surviving and staying affluent in the long term. As you can see, there are some non-linearities here, but basically we need to sprint down steeply until 2030, then marathon towards net zero in the longer term. But elegant as the mountain chart is, it could be hard to imagine the massive numbers involved in this effort. Next slide, please. Which is why we calculated this table. These are essentially even rubber estimates with lots of averaging involved to break down the figures of billion or million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into something that we can relate to. The text in blue is the IPCC's recommendations as summarized in the reports. The numbers below them are the linearized numbers as applied to Apec. They show how many tons of emissions in the region needs to reduce in order to achieve any of the climate change targets. But the massive numbers of gigatons and megatons could be hard to imagine. So we further calculated the equivalent reduction in emissions in cars. We chose cars because everyone could have a good idea how much a typical car emits in a given year. Of course, this does not mean that cars alone are responsible for climate change, or that removing cars alone will solve climate change. There are not enough cars to solve climate change in the region. But this is just to put the effort needed in terms that anyone can relate to. Even with lots of assumptions and simplifications to make the figures relatable, the numbers are still staggering. In order to limit temperature changes to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Apec region basically needs to remove the annual emissions of 192 million cars per year for the next 30 years. The number is lower but still massive for the 2 degrees Celsius target. 117 million cars per year for the next 50 years. Next slide, please. So far, we have only been talking about the science of climate change, the measurements, estimated impacts, and emissions drawdown needed. It's fair to say that the scientists have done their share in informing us about climate change, advising what needs to be done, and warning about the consequences if we don't do it. But there's only so much the science can do to address climate change. Eventually, it is the term of policymakers to make the hard decisions and choices. While science can tell us what needs to be done, it is the role of policy to figure out the hows and the whos. How will we reduce equivalent emissions of 117 million cars per year? Who will pay for it? These are some of the difficult questions that Apec policy members will need to confront. We have no easy answers here at this point, but we have a few things to remember. First, we need clear action. While commitments are good, action is what will get greenhouse gas emissions down. In implementing these actions, we need to take a holistic approach, as the environment and the economy are an integrated system. We also need to anticipate and address the negative impacts of green policies. For example, carbon taxes could be good for the environment and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they could also have impacts on inflation and jobs. This is not to say that we should not pursue green policies, but we need to have the safety nets and social protections to support affected vulnerable populations. Second, we need to measure, and measure. This brings us back to the realm of scientists, but these measurements should be used to inform policy. We need to know if we're on the right track and if we need to change course. We need to analyze the impacts of green policy measures. Policy development takes a lot of time and effort, and we need to ensure that the policies we implement actually are the most effective in addressing climate change. Feel-good, low-effort, and unambitious policies that don't really have impacts on reducing emissions are simply greenwashing. Finally, there needs to be cooperation on the global and regional levels that address climate change. No economy can solve climate change alone, and each economy needs to cooperate. Incidentally, cooperation is in Apec's name, and it is in a good position to contribute to climate change too. Apec has shown that it can work in parallel with global processes to make concrete contributions to global public goods, like globalization and international trade. In a similar manner, Apec is well placed to be the forum where addressing climate change is openly discussed, consensus achieved, and commitments are acted upon. Next slide, please. Yes, and that's it from me. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for that topical presentation on Apec's climate change problem and possible responses. It's particularly topical given the COP26 meetings in Glasgow happening this week as well. We've now come to the Q&A discussion session. Please submit your questions via the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. And while you send those questions, we'll get started with a few that have been sent earlier. From Shinwa in Wellington, a question for you, Dr. Santa Maria. What are the main issues for the leaders meeting on the agenda on November 12th?
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for that question. This it's a good question because it sets the stage for the Leaders Week and what will be discussed when the leaders meet on the 12th. Essentially, there were two parts to this. The first part is a briefing by the IMF on the global economic outlook. So you will get so the leaders will get an opportunity to interact with the IMF as it presents the global economic outlook. The second part is where the leaders will talk about recovering from COVID-19 to build prosperity for all our people and future generations. So it's a broad topic on recovery again. Essentially, each leader will be addressing the following questions, namely, how do we work together through APEC to accelerate economic recovery from COVID-19? So basically using the context that IMF presented and then relating it to our context in APEC and the COVID-19 recovery efforts. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? So basically the leaders will be sharing their best practices or their ideas on how together as APEC we can collectively work or intensify our efforts towards recovery. So those, and also they will look at the aspect of inclusive growth. I mean, when you're talking of recovery, the recovery only makes sense for all of us if it is inclusive. So there will be that strong focus on us working together collectively, even as we have domestic initiatives, but looking at it also collectively, how do we ensure inclusive, sustainable recovery? I hope I answered the question, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca. And a follow-up from the same journalist at Shinwa in Wellington. Will the summit discuss expanding the APEC list of environmental goods to tackle the global climate crisis?
There is work. I mean, that's one of the things that the ministers, when they met, the ministers related to trade, when they met, they asked officials to APEC did a lot of work in environmental goods, if you recall, in 2012. So it's been some time. So what the ministers wanted us to do was to look at that list and see how we could build on it, improve on it, and update it. And so it's a work in progress still. We did a lot of work in terms of updating that list. So the next steps will be, going forward. As I said, it's a work in progress to look at how we can do better. And then let me just draw your attention also to a PSU policy brief on this matter. Maybe Dennis, you want to add to this? The policy brief really points to what policymakers can do in this area. It's already on our website. A good place to look at. Thank you. A good resource, rather.
Dennis, would you like to add something about the policy brief on environmental goods?
Well, just to say that please do check out the policy brief. But in that policy brief, it does mention it's been 10 years since we had the environmental goods list. That was back in 2012, and there's been a lot of emerging new types of environmental technologies. There's been increased demand for different types of environmental goods and services. So we in that policy brief, we talked about some of these issues, and we did make a suggestion to APEC officials that it's time to take a look at our 2012 list, and it's probably time to look at an update of that list and to see what are some of the new different types of environmental goods and services that we should include for the future in terms of coming up with a new list. And I think that is something the officials will probably discuss in a couple of years to come. Thank you.
Sticking with you, Dennis, finance ministers about a month ago recognized that one of the major risks to the recovery is supply chain disruption, and we've seen that in the news recently in particular. How should the APEC region maintain a resilient and stable industrial supply chain?
Okay, we've been doing quite a bit of work on value chain and supply chain resilience, and we've had a number of studies looking at that since this year. And we know that there's been supply disruptions across different types, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and that's also led to also a shortage of different types of microchips. So yeah, I think many of us are realizing it. There's a long waiting list to get a new computer or even different parts of your laptops. So we've talked about different things that multinationals are doing in terms of making their supply chains more resilient. That includes, for example, applications of different types of digital technology, such as blockchain technology, to increase the visibility of their goods and parts and components as they move across the supply chain, to see where the bottlenecks are. We've also looked at, one of the key success stories in the manufacturing sector is what we call just-in-time techniques, right? So you just keep your inventories low, so your margins are because the margins are thin, and you can increase profitability. But unfortunately, when you have a black swan event like the pandemic, that everything becomes out of whack. And I think that's when we need to look at whether it's possible to revisit that kind of manufacturing technique, whether we can apply some buffers to that just-in-time manufacturing techniques. And then a couple of different types of things. I was looking at suppliers, first tier, second tier, kind of an extensive mapping of different types of suppliers, so that when you do have a natural disaster or a pandemic, there are other suppliers that you can go to as part of your plan B or plan C when these things happen. And you'll find that based on some of the work we find that we've looked at, is that many of the companies and multinationals are surprisingly very resilient, because this is not the first time they've encountered these types of events. We had the the Bangkok floods, for example, in 2011. We also had the major earthquake in Japan in 2011. And, a lot of these companies have put in place different types of business continuity plans to take into account of these things. Having said that, the pandemic, of course, is far more longer in terms of the crisis that we're seeing. And it's also, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's all intertwined, right? It's a public health crisis as well as an economic crisis. So, these are some of the things that I'm sure many of the companies are looking at. So take a look at one of our studies, one or two of our studies. We've got a number, and I'm happy to direct you to those links.
Dennis, it seems like there's no better time to plan for a crisis than when you're in a crisis. A question from Chile, where members agreed the La Serena roadmap. This is for you, Dr. Santamaria. In light of an uneven recovery, what is APEC's proposal to ensure women and other vulnerable groups can survive and thrive after the pandemic?
Yep. Thanks for that question. I think APEC has been successful in mainstreaming women's issues. We started this talking about women's economic empowerment way back when, and it was only in 2011 that we managed to really solidify this in the form of the policy partnership. Is that, Michael, correct me? Policy partnership on women and the economy, PPW. So we established a body to really dive deeper into the issues. And I think it was very timely that we did it, because with the pandemic, we've seen, and Emmanuel alluded to it also, how the pandemic has really impacted women in a bigger way than other groups. So the work that we've been doing over the years has really helped us as we try and deal with the issues. So the other aspect that is important under the PPWE was the dashboard that we developed, the Women and the Economy dashboard. I really believe what gets measured gets done. And so this dashboard is really an important tool. It measures the APEC economies across 95 indicators, looking at access. This is specifically for women's access to capital, to assets, access to markets, skills, capacity building, health. Very important for me is leadership, voice, and agency. And they've just introduced another indicator on innovation and technology. So these measurements, then this year we presented the dashboard, the updated dashboard, to the ministers when they met in September. And this gives you an idea of how we've done. It's almost like a report card, how we've done as a group, as individual economies, and what more do we need to do? We've done well in some areas, but we've not done well in others. For example, in leadership, there's clearly not enough done. So what we've managed to do now is really highlight this and bring it to the fore, so that folks get it's no more intuitive. It's no more like, intuitively we perceive that there's a lot more we should do. With this dashboard, with the measurements that we've put, the laws that we've looked and analyzed across APEC economies, we've given the ministers something solid to work with. Where are the areas, where are the gaps that we need to address? And this, along with the La Serena roadmap, the implementation of the La Serena roadmap, I think this in combination helps us then to chart the course and to deal with the issues of women's economic empowerment more concretely. In addition to that, when we're talking about inclusive growth, I just want to add one more point, that inclusive growth is just not about women's economic empowerment. It is also about dealing with MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, as well as, and this year in New Zealand's year, the emphasis on taking the inclusive aspect a little bit further and dealing with indigenous peoples, the economy of the indigenous people. So there is a lot of work that we are doing, and a lot more that we need to do in terms of inclusive and sustainable economic growth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Santamaria. A question from the Borneo Bulletin in Brunei, where the ASEAN Summit was recently held. For you, Emmanuel, what will be the impact of APEC's work on climate change And then a question about process. Will this be submitted to the United Nations or COP26?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. What will be the impact? It depends. It depends on what APEC economies and APEC leaders agree to. What we have seen is that when APEC economies do agree and commit to something, they do deliver results. And we have seen that in the previous slides I showed, that when they did commit to increasing renewables or reforestation, there are results. So it really depends going forward what really is the level of ambition and level of commitment that APEC economies are ready to discuss and to put on the table. And I mean, so it's really a matter of comparing what is being done at APEC, what are the policies being discussed versus what needs to be done in terms of addressing the climate change challenge. And this is all, again, where measurement comes in, as Dr. Santana Maria just said, what gets measured gets done. So, I mean, this is, I gave some rough estimates how much in terms of carbon emissions need to come down in the next 30 or 50 years. So the question is, are the policies that we are ready to implement up to that task as well? So it is quite, I mean, we need to be measuring these as well as we go forward. So in terms of I would not say it's going to be submitted to the, APEC is parallel to what's going on at APEC and COP, just as APEC is parallel to whatever is going on at WTO. But what we have shown over the past 30 years is that APEC can contribute to these global processes that are actually binding. Even if APEC is not binding and voluntary, we also know that APEC economies take their commitments in APEC very, very seriously. And that commitments done in APEC do have an impact at the global level as well.
Certainly that's so, and we've seen some APEC initiatives being integrated into a variety of trade agreements, et cetera. A question on tourism. It plays a key role in many APEC member economies. Will this be discussed at the upcoming meetings? Any news or initiatives from APEC that will help push or open up travel and tourism sector and bring it back to normal, whatever normal might be?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'll take a stab at this question. Commencing safe travel is one of the tasks that we have worked through this year. In fact, under the troika of New Zealand, Malaysia, and Thailand, we've facilitated 2 roundtables, and here's where we brought in the international organizations that are involved, IATA, ICAO, and had very structured conversations around what we can do and how we can begin the process of safe travel. There are models now, more and more models that are in place. Singapore's vaccinated travel lane is one. And this conversation that we're having, we will continue it to next year, because this is also, tourism is a priority for Thailand. And as host of APEC next year, they will carry forward this initiative that New Zealand put together. There are some thoughts, further thoughts going into how we can get travel going back, not just business travel, but also generally travel, but in a safe manner. So there is work, and I'm sure you will hear more of that when the ministers meet and have their discussions. And towards the end of the meeting, you will hear some initiatives that we are beginning to put in place.
Dennis, Emmanuel, would you have anything to add?
Sorry, maybe I'll let Emmanuel talk first, because we did a study looking at cross-border mobility, and I think now is the time to start seriously talking about this, right? Because we need to find ways to support the tourism sector, and we need to see whether there's a much more regional effort to recognize each other's vaccination certificates, as well as as well as health protocols, so that we can start things moving again, because it's going to take a bit of time. But I'll let Emmanuel talk a little bit more about that, since he's led a study on that.
Yep, thank you. Just a quick comment. I actually want to relate. When we did that study, some of the findings actually relate back to what Dennis just said a while ago. It's about really nipping this pandemic in the bud, everywhere and for everyone. So the whole issue of vaccine equity is not really just an issue about morality or being, let's make sure everyone is in it. It's good public health, and it will enable us to reopen our economies. The reason I'm saying that is that even if we have very high vaccine rates in some economies, as long as it's raging in some other economies where vaccine rates are below 40% or below 20%, you just run the risk of having new strains that will force you to close again. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want stop-start, on again, off again, border reopenings. We want to be able to sustain this. And the only way to do this is to really ensure equity in access to vaccines and therapeutics as they're developed now. So this goes back to what Dennis was saying a while ago as well in his presentation on how that really vaccinate everywhere, facilitate, and ensure everyone has access to this.
It seems like vaccinations are the key.
Michael, can I add something that's related to what Rebecca talked about, and also Emmanuel? Rebecca's talked about the dashboard on women in the economy, and there's like 95 different indicators and how important it is to have measurements. I think it's even more important now because of the pandemic, because I think we've seen that the World Bank has talked about how many of their poverty alleviation programs have been set back decades, right? So we're seeing, in fact, that development divide beginning to widen because of the pandemic. So it's all the more important for us to measure and to see how far the different economies have lagged behind. And that's important for APEC, because APEC has got this great platform of developing economies where there's a lot of capacity building programs and activities that can be developed. Looking at the dashboard and different types of indicators, we can see what kind of support that can be done by different economies to help each other. So this is my take. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your views on that. Another question we've heard is that geopolitical tensions have not necessarily abated over the last year. How will that impact the discussion at the leaders' meeting and ministerial meetings this week?
Let's give it a shot. It's important to remember that APEC is an economic forum, not political forum. So we don't have, the conversation. Our conversations are really focused on what we can do from an economic perspective. How do we focus on recovery? So it's very different from that, and every member is equal. So everyone has a voice. So it's not about focusing on the tensions, but focusing on what we can do together. I think that is the value of our APEC ministerials and APEC leaders meetings, even at the senior officials. It is not so much to focus on the tensions, but focus on the possibilities.
Thank you, Dr. Santa Maria. Stay with us. We have another question on trade agreements. There's been interest in the CPTPP this year. RCEP has concluded. Do you think that there will be any new announcements related to these trade agreements made this week during the APEC meetings?
Okay, Dennis, you can jump in later to supplement this. No, I think for us in APEC, our ambition has always been very clear: the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, FTAP, and that is something that the business community has been pushing for. But APEC as a forum is not a negotiating forum. We are non-binding, but we can prepare our members. So we have the capacity building to prepare our members for negotiations, for understanding, for better appreciation of the issues around these agreements. And now that RCEP will enter into force, I'm very pleased about it. I was a founding member, as it were, of RCEP, putting it together, the guiding principles for negotiating RCEP. And so happy to see that it will enter into force on the 1st of January. There's 6 ASEAN member states, and I think 4 of the members, the negotiating parties, have also ratified. So it will enter into force, which is really very positive for the region. CPTPP is gaining momentum as other economies are looking to sign on to it. They have voiced their interest or presented their interest in being party to these agreements. So for us, the genesis of the CPTPP was Apec. It started with four economies that were pushing for it, and then it gained traction as folks saw the value in it. And today we're in a very good place. It's almost 4 years since the implementation of the CPTPP. It's more mature, and the issues that are that are in the CPP, the CPTPP rather, the disciplines and the kind of market access that we've talked about that we have in the CPTPP is really good for the region. I see all these, whether it's RCEP or CPTPP, as rising tides for the region. And when economies, when regional economic integration is deepened, we all benefit. And so, given the environment that we're in with COVID and all the challenges, these are bright sparks. I mean, I'm really reassured, and I'm always an optimist when it comes to this. I'm really reassured when I see that folks are really working to ensure that the economic integration efforts for the region is continuing.
Dennis, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, as what Rebecca mentioned, I mean, CPTPP as well as RCEP are building blocks for the free trade area for the Asia Pacific, which is kind of a long-term goal for APEC. We're not a negotiating forum, that's correct, but we also have, but we do have a lot of capacity building that helps trade negotiators. Many of them may also sit in some of the meetings in APEC. Certainly for us in PSU, we do have these regular publications where we highlight some, new interesting things in some different types of free trade agreements, particularly what we consider next generation type of trade and investment issues. And these help trade negotiators to negotiate different types of free trade agreements.
Thank you. Yes, free, fair, and open trade is our bread and butter and our ambition. And there's definitely multilateral opportunities for us in the years to come. Well, with that, we've come to the end of our session. Thank you very much to our speakers.